So this is a Bing constant velocity carburetor that we're going to rebuild a set of them. Brandon had updated his bike to 1000cc cylinders and pistons. His bike was an R75/6, and I happened to come across somebody who was getting rid of 40mm carbs and also the heads for a 1000cc motor. So we're going to upgrade his engine to use the 40mm carbs, but first we need to rebuild them. Now on the outside of the carburetor is a little rib, and you can see a number 94/40/113. So these are 40mm carburetors, which is the middle number, and the 113 is the left side model number. The right side would be 114. Now here at the top for the cover retaining screws, somebody used Torx screws, so we'll replace those with the stock ones. And we're going to start by taking the top off the carb. Now once the screws are out, you can pull the top up, and then there's a spring inside which you can remove, and then this is the diaphragm and the slide, and that all just pulls right out. And at the bottom of the slide is the jet needle. Now we're going to replace the diaphragm, so Brandon's just backing the screws that hold the retaining plate out of the slide. So now the screws are out, the whole thing just slides right out, and this is the ring that holds the diaphragm into the top of the slide. The next thing we're going to remove is the needle, the jet needle, and you twist it and it pops right out. So that's what the carburetor looks like from the top. Next we're going to remove the float bowl and pull out all the adjusters and jets. You just pop the little retaining clip and the bowl comes right off. And the floats are the first thing we're going to remove, and then we'll get all the jets out of here. Now the floats are secured with a pin, and one end is serrated, which is usually this. You can see the serrations. So what we need to do is drive the pin this direction. I have a nail that I ground down, and then I use just a little hammer like Brandon's doing, and the pin comes right out, and then you can lift the float and the needle, and the float and needle are connected with a little tiny wire. Yeah, this little wire loop slides over this tab on the float, so that's part of the mechanism for moving the float needle. And you'll notice these float needles have the rubber tip, not the hard steel tip. So this is the main jet, and there's a carrier that has the needle jet, so we'll remove all of that. This is the idle jet, and this is the idle adjustment screw, and then this is the cork gasket at the bottom of the float bowl. So we're going to pull all that out of here. Now the main jet comes off with an 8mm wrench, and there's a big flat washer underneath the jet, and then the carrier is 10mm, and that just unscrews. Now the main jet's out. Brandon just turns the carburetor upside down. This is the needle jet right here, and that's all part of that assembly. And there's one other piece we'll get out here in a minute. And then the other part is a sleeve that the needle jet slides into. Now we just unscrew the idle jet, and it just slides right out. There it is. Now the next thing to come out is the idle adjusting screw. Now the idle adjusting screw has a little spring that slides up on the shaft there. Now we're going to just get the old gasket out because we're going to replace that when we do the rebuild. Now this is the choke housing and lever, so we're going to take that off next. So we remove the nut on the shaft. It's an 11 wrench, and then we can pull the pieces of the arm for the choke up off the shaft, and there's 2 pieces to it like that. Now the housing is held with some Phillips, so we'll remove those and pull the housing off the carb body. Now one important detail is the shaft for the choke has a little hole on one end, and that hole always goes next to this tube. You want to remember that when you put this together, because if you reverse it, the choke will not work. Now this is the inside of the choke, and you can see here on the shaft there's a letter L. This is the left side choke disc. You can't mix them up, or again the choke will not work. So what we always do is we keep all the parts for one of the carbs in its own box so we don't get confused. One other thing is there's a gasket here, and we'll replace that too. Now we've pulled the choke shaft and the little circular disc out of the housing, and that's what it looks like. So here's what the casting around the choke looks like. Now the next thing we're going to do is remove this throttle linkage, and we're going to pull the butterfly and the shaft out of the carburetor. So we remove the nut on the shaft, which is a 11 mil nut. Then we just remove the return spring, pull it out of the bottom. Notice on the bottom is the short end, and on the lever arm is the long end of the spring. Now the arm is made up of 2 pieces. This is the inside piece, which is where the adjustment screw pushes, and this is the outside piece of the arm and the spring. Now the bracket is secured with these 2 Phillips screws, so we'll back those out next so we can get the shaft out. Now that the screws are out, the shaft actually has a little slot that this bracket slides into, and that's the bracket. Now the throttle plate is secured by 2 screws, and actually these are new screws. I already removed the old ones. Now the screws are peened, which means if you try to remove them, you'll destroy the threads in the shaft. So when I removed them, what I did is I used a Dremel tool to grind the tops off the screws, and then rotated the shaft back and backed the screws out with a screwdriver. And like I said, these are new screws, so they're going to be easy for Brandon to remove. The other thing that I often do is I use a punch, and I put a couple of punch dots on the outside face of the butterfly, because you have to get it in the right way when you reassemble. Now that the screws are out, we just rotate the shaft, and then you can pull the plate right out, the butterfly plate. There it is. And then you just pull the shaft out. Now the reason we remove the shaft is on this end there is an O-ring that we're going to want to replace, because if that leaks, it screws up your carburation. Now that we have the carburetor taken apart, we're going to soak it in Berryman's carburetor parts cleaner, and usually I soak each carb overnight. That way I can make sure I get all the garbage that might be in the passageways cleaned out. Now this is the Carb Rebuild Kit from Euromoto Electrics for the 40mm carb, and in it are the diaphragms, the float bowl gasket, the choke gasket, and a set of O-rings that go on the various shafts. Now the idle, adjustment, and jet use the two smallest O-rings. The choke shaft has the next largest O-ring. The throttle shaft is one size bigger than that, and then the jet carrier has the largest O-ring. And what we'll do is we'll pull the rings off and just line them up with the new ones to make sure that everything is the right size. Now what I like to use is this angled pick to pull the O-rings off the various parts. And you just sort of pull it out of the slot and then slide it down. Now note on the throttle shaft there are two grooves, but the second one from the threaded end is where the O-ring goes, and that one closest to the threaded end is where the bracket went. Now to install the new O-rings, I wrap the threads with some tape so it's a bit tapered, and then I can use the hook to grab the O-ring and slide it up into the groove. So Brandon has slid the O-ring up on this idle adjustment screw, and then he's going to use the hook and slide it under the ring and carefully pull it up and over the threads, and the tape will protect the O-ring from being cut by the threads, and then have it slide into the groove in the toward the head of the adjusting screw. So the new O-rings installed. Now we just pull the tape off. So the new O-rings on the idle adjusting screw. So all the new O-rings are installed, so we can start putting the carburetor back together. Now what I like to do is take a little bit of silicone grease and coat all of the O-rings with that. It helps keep them moist and preserves them for a longer period of time. Now this is the jet carrier assembly. This is the main jet, which is in the bottom of the float bowl, the big washer, the jet carrier, the needle jet, and this is an atomizer, so the circular part pokes up into the venturi, and the part with the little holes is below the venturi. So this is the order in which you want to insert the parts of the jet assembly. So I start with this atomizer, and I put the circular part right in the hole here, and then I drop the needle jet in, and then the carrier goes in, and then we'll put the main jet on. Now if you look carefully, you can see the little sleeve poking into the venturi, and inside the sleeve is the needle jet. So you tighten this up until it's snug. You don't lean on it too hard. And then the washer goes under the head of the main jet, and we're using 1/60 right now, which is what the carb calls for. Just use the number 8 wrench to snug up the main jet. Now this is the hole for the idle adjustment screw, and you just put the spring on it and then put it in the hole and tighten it down with the screwdriver. And this hole is where the jet for the idle goes. So we have the jet carrier, the idle jet, and the idle adjustment screw installed. Next we're going to put in the choke assembly. So the gasket will go on, and the choke assembly will go in the housing, and then we'll tighten up the screws to hold everything together. Now the shaft got inserted, so the little hole in the end is next to this tube. That's the right orientation for the choke. So since the gasket needs to be compressed uniformly, Brandon tightened up the screws across from each other, and that helps get the gasket laid down nice and smooth. And the other thing we're going to verify is the little hole is pointing toward this tube here. So we have the choke assembly put together in the right orientation. Now this is a different choke linkage arm than was on the carburetors, because Brandon's going to install this on a 75/6, and it needs to have the solid steel cable slide through the little hole in that bushing. So we're going to change out this choke lever arm to the one that matches the 75/6, and then we'll install it. Now the way it goes is the nut faces you. So there's a wave washer and then the nut that goes on. And you have to thread the nut carefully because it's a shaft that's not all the way around and you don't want to mess up the threads. So if it binds up, back it off and start again. Okay, we have the choke assembly installed on the carburetor body. Now we're going to install the throttle shaft and butterfly, and the shaft just slides in with the O-ring over on this side. Now this is the plate, the butterfly plate with the little punch marks, and I just slide that in to the slot in the shaft. So it's not quite lined up, but we might be able to use the screws to help get the plate oriented correctly. So I used a little screwdriver and just sort of jiggled the plate so I could get it about square with the holes. And now we're just going to temporarily install the two screws. So the screws are kind of in there loose. And the next thing we're going to do is install the bracket here. The bracket slides in, and then we'll tighten up the screws to secure the bracket and make sure the throttle shaft doesn't bind up. Now the screws have a split washer underneath, so the shaft is not binding, so that's good. And the critical aspect of the butterfly plate is that it has to be tight at the bottom of the carburetor opening. And what I like to do is hold it up against the light, and if I can't see any light coming out the bottom, I have it exactly where it needs to be. Now I don't peen the screws. I use blue Loctite to lock them in. And what I'll do, or I should say what Brandon will do, is he's going to back one screw out, put the blue Loctite on, put it back in, and then we'll check to make sure the plate is flush with the bottom. And then the second screw the same way, and then we'll have the throttle plate installed correctly. So Brandon's got it together. Let's check if it's binding, and it's smooth moving. And then the other thing we'll do is just verify holding it up to the light. And there's no light coming out at the very bottom, which is the critical part of the orientation of the butterfly plate. So we're good. Now it's time to install the throttle linkage. So these are the parts for the throttle linkage. This is the idle adjusting screw, and this is the piece of the linkage with the tab that'll fit up under the screw, and then this one will go on the outside, and that's the throttle return spring. So Brandon's going to put in the adjustment screw first, just kind of get it seated. And then we have the piece of the linkage with the tab right pointing up underneath the adjustment screw. And then the second piece of the linkage goes on, and this little slot is where the long end of the spring is installed, and then the short end goes down here. So the long end of the spring goes into that slot, and the short end goes into the bottom here. So there's a wave washer, and then the nut goes on, and again, very carefully align the nut and don't get it cross-threaded because it's easy to do that. And that's a brass shaft, so you can damage the threads real easily. So work it until it'll spin real easy. So now the linkage is installed, we're just checking again, and the throttle plate rolls nice and smooth, no binding. Now later on, we'll adjust the throttle idle adjusting screw, but right now we're just going to leave it like that. So this is the new float bowl fuel valve and the little clip that goes through it on this end, and then the clip slides over the tab on the floats, and these are a new floats assembly. So the clip fits through a tiny hole in the end of the needle valve, and there's a little bar that locks on so it won't fall off. Now the serration on the pin is right there, and what I like to do is have the serration on the engine side of the carburetor. So if I'm on the side of the road and I have to go knock this out to get to a float or get to the fuel valve, I can just tap it out without pulling the carb off the engine. So we slid the little wire bail on the tab on the float and tip it up like that, and then we drop the valve into the fuel inlet hole like that, and then we can run the pin through the posts. So the pin just slides through the little tab on the float and into the two holes in the post, and then what I do is I take a little pair of needle nose and carefully pull the serrations in to the inside post. There we are. And just verify everything's moving easy. Now we're going to install the new float bowl gasket, and then we'll put the float bowl on. Now before we install the float bowl, I want to make sure that the vent tube is not plugged and the idle fuel well is open. So we're going to test those. So what I have is a little piece of garden wire, and I just strip the insulation off it and slide it through and make sure it comes out the bottom of the vent hole so that it's not plugged. To check that the little hole at the bottom is open, we'll put a little carb cleaner in the well, and it should leak out into the float bowl. And there it is. So that's okay. Then we just install the bail, and there we go. Now the next thing we do is put in the new diaphragm into the slide and install that in the top of the carb. Now this is the new diaphragm, and there's a little notch here and there's a notch here, so they line right up. And then we put the cap in and the 4 screws. Now before Brandon tightened them all the way up, he checked to make sure the tab fit in the slot in the slide, and they're lined right up. That's critical. You don't want to screw that up. Now I got a new jet needle, and I checked the specs in the Bing book, and the clip goes into 2 notches. So Brandon's going to turn it and twist it, and then we'll measure the length of the needle exposed to be sure that we have it right. Now what I like to do is measure this distance, and for the number 2 position it should be about 47 millimeters long, and that's what we got. Now in the top of the carb there's another notch, and on the outside of the diaphragm is the tab, and those need to line up. Also, as you insert the slide, you want to make sure the needle slides into the jet needle. So you want to go very carefully, make sure it fits in there. So here's the tab and the notch, and they line right up. So now we can put the top on the carb. Now this carb has a spring, and some of the early model carbs don't have the spring. Anyway, make sure you put that in right over the center post, and then you put the top on. What I like to do is then look in the bore and see that the slide seems centered where the cutout is, so it's about equal on either side, and that's right where we are. So it's time to put the top on. Now that we got the top on, just verifying that the slide is centered, and it is. Now the other thing we're going to install is the vacuum port screw and the washer. Just because I'm crazy, the choke is smooth and the throttle's moving smooth. So we have rebuilt the carburetor and it's functional.